The morning of June 18, 1982, was cold and foggy in London. The Thames slowly carried its waters under the ancient arches of Blackfriars Bridge, when a young employee, hurrying to work, noticed something strange. Under the massive structures of the bridge, partially hidden by water, a human figure was visible. The police, arriving at the scene, found the body of a man in an expensive suit. A rope, wrapped around his neck, was tied to the steel structures of the bridge. In the deceased's pockets, they found bricks weighing about 5 kilograms in total and $12,000 in cash. The identity of the victim was quickly established. Roberto Calvi, a 52-year-old Italian, chairman of the board of directors of Italy's largest private bank, Banco Ambrosiano. The man, known as God's banker, due to his close ties with the Vatican, was found dead in a foreign country under mysterious circumstances. British investigators were quick to declare it a suicide. However, many details raised questions. How could an elderly banker in an expensive suit climb onto the scaffolding under the bridge himself? Why were there no traces of rope or rust from the metal structures on his palms? And most importantly, why would a suicide victim fill his pockets with bricks if he intended to hang himself, not drown? Roberto Calvi was born in 1920 in Milan, into a family of moderate means. Nothing in his early childhood foreshadowed his future fame and tragic end. He began his career in banking from the very bottom as an ordinary clerk at Banca Commerciale Italiana. The methodical and meticulous young man quickly demonstrated extraordinary abilities in the financial sphere. In 1947, fate made a significant turn in his career. Calvi got a job at Banco Ambrosiano. This Milanese bank, founded in the 19th century by Father Giuseppe Tovini, was originally created as a financial institution for Catholics. Even then, there were special relations between the bank and the church. Calvi's career progression was rapid. By the mid-60s, he held the post of general director, and in 1975, he became chairman of the board of directors. Under his leadership, the modest regional bank transformed into one of Italy's largest financial institutions, with branches in Latin America, Nassau, Luxembourg, and other financial centers. A turning point in Calvi's career was his acquaintance with Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, head of the Institute for the Works of Religion, the official bank of the Vatican. This tall American of Lithuanian descent, who was called, quote, Zero, for his powerful physique and influence, saw in the ambitious banker an ideal partner for his financial operations. The Vatican, through the IOR, acquired a significant stake in Banco Ambrosiano, and Calvi received the unofficial title of, quote, One. This connection gave him not only prestige, but also incredible opportunities for financial maneuvers. After all, the Vatican Bank, as a financial institution of a sovereign state, was not subject to the usual rules of financial regulation and banking supervision. In the late 70s, Calvi grew close to another influential force, the secret Masonic lodge Propaganda Due, or P2, led by Licio Gelli. This organization, operating under the guise of an ordinary Masonic lodge, was in fact a parallel government of Italy, uniting high-ranking politicians, generals, heads of special services, industrialists, and financiers within its ranks. By the early 80s, Calvi's financial empire reached its zenith, but the first cracks were already appearing beneath the brilliant facade. The Italian financial police began an investigation into the activities of Banco Ambrosiano and discovered a network of shell companies in offshore zones. In 1981, Calvi was arrested on charges of illegal capital export from the country and spent 2 months in prison. Banco Ambrosiano was not just a bank, it was a financial octopus. Its tentacles spread across the globe. By the early 1980s, this structure had transformed into an intricate web of hundreds of companies, branches, and subsidiaries scattered across dozens of countries. At the apex of this pyramid was the Milan headquarters, but the true power was concentrated in offshore entities, especially Banco Ambrosiano Holdings in Luxembourg and Banco Ambrosiano Overseas Limited in the Bahamas. In this scheme, the Vatican played a key role. The Institute for the Works of Religion, IOR, the official bank of the Holy See, owned a significant stake in Banco Ambrosiano. But most importantly, the IOR acted as a guarantor for many of Calvi's bank deals and operations. Letters of patronage, signed by Archbishop Marcinkus, opened doors to the world of international finance, where the Vatican's name commanded boundless trust. Under this sacred cover, Calvi created a veritable shadow empire. A whole network of shell companies with pious names like quote 0, quote 1, quote 2, quote 3, and others were registered in Panama. Formally, the Vatican Bank was listed as their owner, but in reality, they were managed by Calvi and his trusted associates. Through this system, dizzying operations were carried out. Milan's Banco Ambrosiano issued huge loans to Panamanian companies, which then redirected the funds to other offshore entities. And from there, the money went to finance political parties, acquire media assets, or simply disappeared into the personal accounts of those involved. The Ambrosiano Andino Bank in Peru played a special role in this scheme. This small Latin American branch, with a charter capital of only $50 million, somehow miraculously issued loans totaling over $1 billion. Most of this money never returned to the banking system. The Vatican's cover gave Calvi's operations a special status. When Italian financial regulators began asking uncomfortable questions, the diplomatic immunity of the Holy See came into play. The Institute for the Works of Religion refused to provide information about its offshore companies, citing its special status as the bank of a sovereign state. The Institute for Works of Religion, also known as the Vatican Bank, was established in 1942 by Pope Pius XII. Initially, its mission seemed noble: to manage the finances of religious organizations and charitable institutions of the Catholic Church. However, over time, this financial institution transformed into something much more controversial. The uniqueness of the Vatican Bank lay in its special legal status. Located within the sovereign state of Vatican City, it was not subject to Italian banking laws or international financial reporting standards. This created ideal conditions for operations that, in any other country, would have triggered immediate regulatory intervention. A key figure in the history of relations between Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. This tall American of Lithuanian descent headed the Institute for Works of Religion in 1971 and remained its director until 1989. Marcinkus was not a typical church hierarch. A former American football player, he possessed an assertive character and business acumen more typical of Wall Street than the Holy See. Marcinkus and Calvi quickly found common ground. They were united by a desire for financial power and a willingness to operate on the edge of the law. The Archbishop provided Calvi with what was necessary for his schemes: legitimacy and the protection of the Vatican. The mechanism of their cooperation was simple and brilliant in its cynicism. The Vatican Bank acted as the nominal owner of Calvi's offshore companies and also provided letters of guarantee in which it guaranteed the obligations of these companies. With such support, Panamanian and Luxembourg shell companies could attract enormous loans, which then disappeared into the labyrinths of international transfers. At the same time, the Institute for Works of Religion maintained an impeccable religious facade. Officially, its activities were aimed at supporting missionary work and charity. In reality, a significant portion of the funds went to finance political movements, especially anti-communist ones, covert operations, and the personal enrichment of the scheme's participants. When Italian authorities began an investigation, Marcinkus invariably took refuge behind the walls of the Vatican, using diplomatic immunity. "You can't run the church on Hail Marys." His famous phrase became a symbol of the cynicism that had permeated the Holy of Holies of Catholicism. In the shadow of official Italy in the early 80s of the 20th century, there existed an organization whose influence was so extensive that it was called a state within a state. The Masonic Lodge Propaganda Due, or simply P2, was formerly just one of many Masonic associations. However, under the leadership of Licio Gelli, it transformed into a powerful shadow structure that entangled the entire country in its networks. Gelli, a former fascist who became a successful businessman, created an organization unparalleled in post-war Europe. The list of P2 members, discovered during a search of his villa in 1981, shocked Italian society. It included 3 ministers of the current government, 43 parliamentarians, the heads of all the country's special services, 12 carabinieri generals, 5 financial guard generals, 52 high-ranking army officers, owners of major newspapers and TV channels, industrialists, and of course, bankers. Among them, Roberto Calvi. Membership in P2 gave Calvi access to incredible opportunities. Through his Masonic brethren, he could influence political decisions, obtain secret information, and block investigations against his bank. In turn, Banco Ambrosiano became the lodge's financial instrument, laundering money and financing its operations. Gelli's plan was ambitious: to establish an authoritarian regime in Italy, disguised as a democracy. A document titled, quote, "Found among his papers," envisioned the gradual seizure of control over all key state institutions, from the judiciary to the media. P2's connections with organized crime played a special role in this scheme. The Sicilian mafia and the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta used Calvi's banking system to launder money from drug trafficking. Billions of dollars passed through the accounts of Panamanian companies formerly owned by the Vatican Bank, but effectively controlled by Gelli's people. In this criminal triangle, P2, the Vatican, the mafia, Calvi played the role of financial architect. He created complex schemes that allowed criminal money to turn into legal investments and political bribes into harmless banking operations. By the early 1980s, Roberto Calvi's financial empire was a classic pyramid, ready to collapse at the slightest breath of wind. At the base of this structure lay a network of dozens of shell companies scattered across offshore jurisdictions from Panama to Luxembourg. Each of these firms existed only on paper, without offices, employees, or real activity. The scheme worked with diabolical simplicity. Milan's Banco Ambrosiano issued enormous loans to these fictitious companies with minimal or no collateral. The only guarantee was letters of patronage from the Vatican's Institute for Religious Works, which vaguely stated that the Holy See, quote, "zero" these organizations. These ghost companies, having received millions of dollars, redirected the funds through a convoluted chain of transactions. Part of the money returned as, quote, "won" in Banco Ambrosiano's own shares, artificially supporting their value. Another part went to finance political parties, primarily of a right-wing persuasion. Significant sums settled in the personal accounts of the scheme's participants in Swiss banks. The operation involving the Peruvian branch Ambrosiano Andino was particularly sophisticated. This small bank in Lima, with a charter capital of $50 million, managed to issue loans totaling over $1 billion. The recipients were the same Panamanian companies nominally owned by the Vatican. When Italian regulators began to show interest in these transactions, a second layer of defense came into play: the Masonic Lodge P2. Its members, holding key positions in the Bank of Italy, the Ministry of Finance, and intelligence services, blocked investigations or led them to a dead end. By the spring of 1982, the pyramid began to creak at the seams. The total amount of unsecured loans exceeded $1.3 billion, a colossal sum by the standards of the time. The Vatican Bank, realizing the scale of the problem, began to distance itself from its recent partner. Archbishop Marcinkus refused to provide new guarantee letters. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, Calvi organized one last major operation. Through his controlled insurance holding company, La Centrale, he attempted to acquire a controlling stake in the prestigious Italian publishing house Rizzoli. This deal was intended to create the appearance of successful business expansion and attract new investors. However, Italy's financial police, having received information from sources within the bank, blocked the transaction. Beneath the grim facade of Vatican finances, another sinister shadow lurked: Italian organized crime. The connections between Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican Bank, and the mafia represented one of the most shocking aspects of the entire scandal. The Sicilian Cosa Nostra and the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta found in Calvi's banking system a perfect mechanism for laundering their illicit proceeds. In the 70s and early 80s of the 20th century, drug trafficking became the main source of income for the Italian mafia. Heroin, produced in Sicilian laboratories from morphine supplied by the Middle East, flooded the streets of American cities. Experts estimated that the annual turnover of this business amounted to several billion dollars. The mafiosis' problem was how to transform mountains of cash into legal assets. This is where Roberto Calvi entered the scene with his international network of banks and shell companies. The scheme was meticulously refined. Cash from drug sales was transferred to Switzerland, where it was deposited into anonymous accounts. From there, funds were transferred to Panamanian companies formerly owned by the Vatican Bank. Subsequently, the money was invested in legitimate businesses or returned to mafia families in the form of loans from respectable financial institutions. Confirmation of these connections began to surface after the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano. Particularly valuable were the testimonies of repentant mafiosi who decided to cooperate with justice. Tommaso Buscetta, one of the first major pentiti repentants, mentioned in his testimony regular meetings between high-ranking mafiosi and representatives of Banco Ambrosiano. Even more direct evidence was provided by Francesco Marino Manoia, a former member of the Sicilian mafia who became an informant. According to him, Cosa Nostra boss Michele Sindona personally met with Calvi to discuss financial operations. "Calvi's bank was our washing machine," Manoia told investigators. Financial documents seized during searches confirmed these testimonies. Among the papers found in the safe of one of the mafia bosses were statements from Panamanian company accounts and coded instructions for transferring funds. Analysis of bank transactions showed that millions of dollars circulated between accounts linked to known criminal groups and companies affiliated with Banco Ambrosiano. The Vatican Bank, hiding behind its special status, provided the necessary legitimacy to this system. When Italian investigators tried to obtain information about suspicious transactions, the Institute for Works of Religion invariably invoked its sovereign status and refused to cooperate. In early June of 1982, Roberto Calvi understood that the sand in his hourglass was running out. The financial empire he had so meticulously built over the years was crumbling before his eyes. Banco Ambrosiano was on the verge of collapse, and Italian authorities were tightening the investigative noose around his neck. On June 7th, immediately after the weekend, Calvi made a desperate decision: to flee Italy. He knew his passport had been confiscated, and all airports and border crossings had been instructed to detain him if he attempted to leave the country. But the God's banker still had influential friends. With one phone call, he organized his escape. That same evening, Calvi changed into simple clothes, put on a fake mustache and glasses, taking only a small bag with documents and cash. Accompanied by his bodyguard Silvano Vittorio, he got on a motorcycle and headed for the Italian-Slovenian border. Crossing it with forged documents under the name Gianfranco Carboni, Calvi began his last journey across Europe. From Slovenia, he went to Austria, then to Switzerland, where he met with representatives of the Vatican Bank. The meeting was tense. Calvi demanded that the Institute for Religious Works acknowledge its obligations under letters of guarantee totaling over $1 billion. Archbishop Marcinkus, however, refused to take responsibility, stating that the letters had been issued without proper authorization. Desperate for support from the church, Calvi tried to contact other influential patrons. He called Licio Gelli, the head of Lodge P2, but Gelli was already in hiding in South America, fleeing Italian justice. Calvi turned to his contacts in the mafia, but there too he received a cold reception. The crime bosses were unwilling to risk ties with a man who had become too toxic. On June 16th, after a week of wandering across Europe, Calvi arrived in London. He was accompanied by Flavio Carboni, a mysterious figure connected both to Lodge P2 and Sardinian organized crime. In the British capital, they stayed in a modest apartment in Chelsea Cloisters. Calvi looked haggard and paranoid. He refused to go out during the day and constantly checked if he was being followed. On the evening of June 17th, Calvi met with unknown people in his apartment. Neighbors heard a loud conversation in Italian. Around 2300 hours, Calvi was last seen alive. He left the building accompanied by two men. What happened in the next few hours remains one of the darkest mysteries of 20th century financial history. The next morning, his body would be found under Blackfriars Bridge with a rope around his neck and bricks in the pockets of his expensive suit. The London police, arriving at the scene where Roberto Calvi's body was discovered, quickly concluded suicide. The official verdict stated that the Italian banker, in a state of deep depression due to the collapse of his financial empire, decided to end his life in a rather extravagant way. According to this version, Calvi independently climbed onto the scaffolding under Blackfriars Bridge, filled the pockets of his expensive suit with bricks, and hanged himself. The case was closed just a few days after the tragedy. However, from the very first hours of the investigation, many details raised serious doubts among independent experts and Italian investigators. First and foremost, the absence of marks on Calvi's hands was striking. If the 52-year-old banker had indeed climbed the rusty scaffolding of the bridge, his palms would inevitably have retained traces of rust and paint. However, the deceased's hands were clean, without the slightest indication that he had climbed the metal structures. Even strangers seemed the choice of suicide method. Why would a person intending to hang himself fill his pockets with bricks weighing about 5 kilograms in total? This step would make sense in an attempt to drown, but not in a hanging. Calvi's family immediately rejected the suicide theory. His widow Clara categorically stated, "My husband was not a suicide. He was killed by those who feared his revelations." Italian authorities, dissatisfied with the hasty conclusions of their British counterparts, launched their own investigation. In 1992, 10 years after Calvi's death, Italian forensic experts exhumed the banker's body and performed a second autopsy. The results were shocking. Characteristic marks were found on the deceased's neck, indicating that Calvi had been strangled and then hanged, a classic tactic of professional killers disguising a crime as suicide. In 1998, a British court overturned the original suicide verdict and ordered a new investigation. Finally, in 2002, a group of forensic experts from the UK and Italy conducted a large-scale reconstruction of the circumstances of Calvi's death. They built an exact replica of a section of Blackfriars Bridge and simulated various scenarios. The conclusion was unambiguous. Roberto Calvi could not have physically orchestrated his own death in this manner. He was killed somewhere else, and then his body was transported under the bridge, and his suicide was staged. In 2003, London police officially reclassified Calvi's death from suicide to murder. But who was behind this perfectly planned crime? The answer to this question leads us into the dark corridors of power, where the interests of the Vatican, the mafia, and secret Masonic lodges intersect. Who killed Roberto Calvi? This question has tormented investigators from several countries for decades. Among the numerous theories, the confession of Italian mafioso Francesco Di Carlo, made in 2005, deserves the most attention. Di Carlo, serving a life sentence for drug trafficking, unexpectedly stated that he was directly involved in the elimination of the banker. According to him, the order came from Sicilian mafia bosses Giuseppe Calò and Pippo Bono. The motive was the disappearance of $40 million of mafia money, which passed through Calvi's banking system. Di Carlo claimed that he met with the banker in London shortly before his death, trying to find out the fate of the missing funds. When it became clear that the money could not be recovered, the order for his elimination was given. Also noteworthy is the theory of the involvement of the Masonic Lodge P2. After the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, Calvi became the holder of extremely dangerous information about the financial machinations of high-ranking lodge members. In desperation, he could threaten with revelations, which made him mortally dangerous for many influential figures. It is remarkable that Blackfriars Bridge, under which Calvi's body was found, has symbolic meaning for Masons. In translation, its name means Black Friars, a direct reference to the Dominican order with which a certain branch of Freemasonry is historically associated. Was this a sinister signature of the killers or a coincidence? No less convincing is the theory of the involvement of intelligence agencies. Banco Ambrosiano was actively used to finance anti-communist movements around the world, especially in Latin America. These operations were often carried out in cooperation with the American CIA. When the bank was on the verge of collapse, there was a threat of revealing these secret funding channels. The elimination of Calvi could have been a preventive measure to preserve state secrets. Finally, the involvement of the Vatican itself cannot be ruled out. The Institute for the Works of Religion could have lost hundreds of millions of dollars in the event of a full investigation into the activities of Banco Ambrosiano. In addition, the reputational risks for the Catholic Church were enormous. Archbishop Marcinkus, head of the Vatican Bank, had every reason to wish Calvi to be silenced forever. The professionalism of the execution of the murder indicates the work of experienced killers. The body was delivered under the bridge at night, probably by boat, which required perfect coordination and knowledge of the Thames tides. The murder was carefully disguised as a suicide, a standard tactic of professional executors working for intelligence agencies or organized crime. Roberto Calvi's death was just the beginning of a financial earthquake that shook not only Italy, but the entire European banking system. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano proved to be the largest banking bankruptcy in Italian history since World War II. The bank's total debt amounted to $1,300 billion, an astronomical sum by the standards of the early 1980s. Just a few days after Calvi's body was discovered under a London bridge, the Bank of Italy appointed a provisional administration to Banco Ambrosiano. The inspection revealed a catastrophic situation. Most of the bank's assets existed only on paper, and there were no real funds to cover obligations to depositors and creditors. On July 26, 1982, just over a month after Calvi's death, Italian authorities officially announced the liquidation of the once mighty financial institution. Panic immediately gripped Italy's financial markets. Shares of other banks plummeted, and depositors rushed to withdraw their money, fearing a chain reaction of bankruptcies. On the Milan Stock Exchange, the index fell by a record 7% in a single trading day. The government had to intervene urgently to prevent a full-scale financial crisis. Italian Finance Minister Beniamino Andreatta convened an emergency meeting with the leadership of the Bank of Italy and representatives of the country's largest financial institutions. A consortium of 7 leading Italian banks was formed, which pledged to guarantee private deposits in Banco Ambrosiano. This somewhat calmed ordinary depositors, but the problem of huge debts to corporate clients and foreign banks remained unresolved. The international consequences of Banco Ambrosiano's collapse proved no less dramatic. The bank's foreign branches in Luxembourg, Peru, Nicaragua, and the Bahamas also declared insolvency. Hundreds of banks worldwide that had provided loans to Calvi's empire structures faced the threat of their own bankruptcy. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel, acting as a kind of bank of central banks, convened a special meeting to coordinate actions to minimize the damage from the collapse of the Italian giant. Representatives of the central banks of Europe, the USA, and Japan developed a plan to provide emergency liquidity to financial institutions most affected by Banco Ambrosiano's bankruptcy. The blow was particularly painful for the Vatican. The Institute for Religious Works, as the largest shareholder of Banco Ambrosiano and guarantor of many of its dubious operations, came under enormous pressure. Creditors demanded compensation from the Holy See, citing letters of guarantees signed by Archbishop Marcinkus. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal dealt a crushing blow to the Vatican's reputation. The Holy See, for centuries embodying moral authority for millions of Catholics, suddenly found itself at the center of a sordid tale of financial machinations, money laundering, and ties to the mafia. Pope John Paul II, understanding the scale of the catastrophe, was forced to personally intervene. In closed meetings with cardinals, he demanded a full report on the activities of the Institute for Religious Works and its connections with Calvi's empire. The results of the internal investigation proved so shocking that they were immediately classified. The Vatican faced an extremely difficult choice: admit responsibility for its bank's actions and pay compensation, or deny any involvement in Calvi's schemes. After long debates, an intermediate strategy was chosen. In official statements, representatives of the Holy See categorically denied legal responsibility for the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano. Archbishop Marcinkus asserted that the letters of patronage issued to Panamanian companies were not financial guarantees, but merely confirmed the Vatican's, quote, "in these structures." However, behind the scenes, intense negotiations were underway with the creditors of the bankrupt bank. In May 1984, After almost 2 years of intense discussions, the Vatican agreed to pay $250 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors. This sum represented approximately 1/5 of the total losses, but was presented as a voluntary contribution rather than an admission of guilt. Simultaneously with the financial settlement, the Vatican began internal reforms. The Institute for Religious Works was placed under stricter control. Archbishop Marcinkus, though he retained his post for several years, was gradually removed from the actual management of the Holy See's finances. In 1989, he finally left the Vatican and returned to the USA, where he spent the rest of his life as a parish priest in Arizona. Despite these measures, the reputational damage proved colossal. Public opinion polls showed a sharp decline in trust in the church hierarchy, especially in Italy. Many believers were shocked not so much by the fact of financial irregularities itself, but by the cynical refusal of the Vatican to acknowledge its responsibility. How can the Church teach us honesty and morality if it does not follow these principles itself? This question was asked by millions of Catholics worldwide. The reaction of ordinary priests was an especially painful blow. Many of them, working daily with the poor and needy, were outraged that their flock donated their last money to the Church, while the highest hierarchs used these funds for dubious financial operations. In some parishes, donations decreased by 1/3. Pope John Paul II, understanding the depth of the crisis, initiated a large-scale program to restore trust in the Church. He made an unprecedented number of pastoral visits, meeting with ordinary believers and emphasizing the spiritual rather than material mission of Catholicism. However, the consequences of the scandal were never fully overcome. The shadow of Banco Ambrosiano and God's banker, Roberto Calvi, continues to haunt the Vatican to this day. Every new financial reform in the Holy See inevitably brings back memories of those dark days of the early 80s, when priests in black cassocks were embroiled in mafia money laundering and the financing of secret political operations. The history of legal proceedings surrounding the death of Roberto Calvi and the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano stretched for decades, turning into one of the most convoluted legal labyrinths of the 20th century. The first trials began almost immediately after the tragic events of the summer of 1982. The Italian prosecution brought charges against the surviving executives of Banco Ambrosiano. Carlo De Benedetti, who replaced Calvi as chairman of the board of directors a few months before the collapse, was accused of fraud and falsifying bank statements. After years of proceedings, he was acquitted, as it was recognized that he had not had enough time to delve into his predecessor's criminal schemes. The Vatican skillfully used its special legal status to protect Archbishop Marcinkus from Italian justice. When Milanese investigators attempted to question the head of the Institute for Religious Works, he simply refused to leave Vatican territory, where he was protected by diplomatic immunity. The arrest warrant issued by Italian judges thus remained unexecuted. A special chapter in this legal saga comprised the investigations into the circumstances of Calvi's death itself. The initial verdict of suicide by the British Coroner's Court was challenged by the banker's family. In 1983, a new hearing was held, which changed the formulation to death from undetermined causes. This paved the way for new investigations. In 1992, Italian authorities exhumed Calvi's body and conducted a new examination. The results of the forensic investigation indicated murder, not suicide. However, it took another 11 years for London police to officially reclassify the case and begin a murder investigation. The most high-profile trial began in Rome in October 2005. 5 people were in the dock: Sicilian mafioso Pippo Calò, known as the "one businessman Flavio Carboni, who accompanied Calvi in his last days, Ernesto Diotalevi, connected with the Roman underworld, banker Licio Gelli, former head of the P2 Masonic Lodge, and former Secret Service agent Francesco Di Carlo. The prosecution built its case on the testimonies of repentant mafiosi and financial documents indicating the motive for the murder: the disappearance of large sums of mafia money that passed through Calvi's bank. However, the defense managed to cast sufficient doubt on the reliability of the witness testimonies. After 18 months of hearings, in June 2007, all defendants were acquitted due to lack of evidence. The Vatican banking scandal, linked to the death of Roberto Calvi, left a deep mark not only on the financial world, but also on popular culture. The story of the God's banker, found under a London bridge, proved so dramatic and symbolic that it inevitably inspired numerous creative works. Perhaps the most famous artistic interpretation of these events was Francis Ford Coppola's film, released in 1990. In the final part of the famous gangster saga, one of the central plot lines revolves around the Corleone mafia clan's attempt to acquire a controlling stake in the fictional company International Immobiliare, closely connected to the Vatican. The murder of a character named Frederick Keinzig, found hanged on a bridge in London, directly references Calvi's fate. Coppola masterfully showed the intertwining interests of the mafia, the Vatican, and high politics, creating an artistic image that largely corresponded to real events. Literature also did not shy away from this topic. David Yallop's novel In God's Name, published in 1984, became an international bestseller. The author put forward a sensational theory about the connection between Calvi's death, the mysterious demise of Pope John Paul I, and a large-scale conspiracy within the Vatican. Although many of Yallop's assertions were later disputed by historians and journalists, his book shaped public perception of the Vatican banking scandal for decades to come. Equally significant was the documentary film God's Banker, directed by Italian filmmaker Giuseppe Ferrara in 1991. The film, based on thorough journalistic investigation, presented viewers with a detailed reconstruction of the events that led to the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano and Calvi's death. The film caused a real shock in Italy, forcing many to reconsider their attitude towards financial and religious institutions. Television documentary series regularly return to this story. The British channel BBC released several investigations dedicated to the mystery of the London Bridge. The American History Channel included Calvi's case in its series on the greatest unsolved crimes of the 20th century. Italian television virtually annually releases new programs attempting to shed light on the mysteries of 40 years ago. In the world of computer games and internet culture, the story of God's Banker also found its reflection. Elements of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal were used in the plots of popular conspiracy thriller games. Internet forums and communities dedicated to secret societies and mysterious crimes regularly discuss new theories about who was actually behind Calvi's murder. The cultural influence of the Vatican banking scandal extends far beyond specific works of art. It significantly changed public perception of financial institutions and their connection to religious organizations. The image of a banker connected to both the church and the mafia became archetypal for popular culture, reflecting society's deep distrust of the merging of spiritual and financial power. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal and the tragic death of Roberto Calvi left a deep mark on the global financial system. 40 years later, we can assess the true scale of these events and their impact on the present. First and foremost, This case became a turning point in the regulation of international financial flows. After the collapse of Calvi's empire, banking supervisory bodies worldwide tightened control over cross-border operations and offshore structures. The Vatican, despite initial resistance, was forced to implement a series of profound reforms to its financial system. Under John Paul II, these changes were half-hearted. The Institute for the Works of Religion received new leadership and a more transparent structure, but retained significant autonomy. Benedict XVI took the next step, signing an agreement with the European Union to comply with international anti-money laundering standards. A real breakthrough occurred under Pope Francis. In 2013, shortly after his election, he initiated a complete restructuring of Vatican finances. A Council for Financial Affairs was established with the participation of international experts. Modern accounting standards were introduced, and banking secrecy ceased to be absolute. For the first time in history, the Vatican agreed to audits by independent auditors and international organizations. The lessons of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal were also reflected in the global fight against money laundering. The Financial Action Task Force on Money Laundering, FATF, established in 1989, largely drew upon the experience of this case when developing its recommendations. Today, banks are required to verify the sources of large deposits, track suspicious transactions, and report them to competent authorities, practices that could have prevented Calvi's machinations if they had existed in his time. However, it would be naive to believe that all lessons from this scandal have been fully learned. The financial crisis of 2008, the Panama Papers scandal, and numerous revelations of offshore schemes show that the shadows of the past are still with us. Modern financial criminals use more sophisticated methods, but the essence remains the same: blurring responsibility through a network of shell companies, using jurisdictions with low levels of control, and seeking high-ranking patrons. The story of Roberto Calvi today serves as a warning. It reminds us of the danger of the merger of financial, political, and spiritual power, of the destructive consequences of impunity, and of how easily the most respected institutions can be compromised by greed and corruption. Perhaps the main lesson of this story is that transparency and accountability are the only reliable defense against the recurrence of such tragedies in the future.